last time we looked at the church in Ephesus and the message to it. The second church is the church in Smyrna. Does someone want to read that out for us in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8 through to 11?
And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death.
So just to sum up, what is the church in Smyrna dealing with? What are the types of things that Jesus is bringing up in his letter to them?
Horrendous persecution, tribulation 10 days. And because it's be thou faithful unto death, it is really bad.
Yeah, there's heaps of persecution and tribulation they're going through. Now, something that stood out to me is there is another group of people mentioned here when he's talking about the tribulations and the things they're going through. He says, I know the blasphemies of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Now, who were the Jews? Okay, if we look not specifically, but who were they meant to be? Who did God call them to be? What was the role that the Jews were supposed to play in God's plan?
They were meant to be God's people, God's special people, to represent him accurately.
Does someone want to read out Romans chapter 2, verse 28 and 29?
I'll go ahead and read that. You can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, 28 says, for you are not a true Jew just because you were born of Jewish parents, or because you have gone through the ceremony of circumcision. No, the true Jew is one whose heart is right with God. And true circumcision is not merely obeying the letter of the law. Rather, it is a change of heart produced by God's Spirit. And a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God, not from people.
So there in Romans, in chapter 2, and he goes into a lot more detail in chapter 9 and 10 about, you know, the true Israel and the true Jews are those who are God's people, who are called according to the promise, that are called to be overcomers. And so there's this group here that are claiming to be Jews. They're claiming to be God's church, God's chosen people. But he's saying that they are not. Okay, they're the synagogue of Satan. Now, for those who were here last week when we looked at the church of Ephesus, what were they dealing with? Okay, they had a similar issue going on in their church. If anyone can remember that, or just read back at the beginning of chapter 2 in Revelation.
They had people that say they were apostles and they're not, and they found them to be liars.
And they didn't love each other.
Yeah, yeah. And so with the church at Ephesus, they had people claiming to be apostles but were liars, and they had those that were practicing the deeds of Nicolaitans. And so you had these people coming and trying to bring in false teachings and compromise into the church, but they were being found out, and the church was being guarded against them. But here in Smyrna, it's the same idea of these false brethren, these false people of God, bringing persecutions against God's true people. As Paul does this really well in Romans, and he goes back and says, look at what happened with with Cain and Abel, with Isaac and Ishmael. Okay, the one who was born after the flesh persecuted the one who was born after the spirit. And he's saying it's the same thing in his day with the Jews persecuting the Christians. Those who are after the promise are persecuted by those after the flesh. And so those here in Smyrna are suffering under this persecution. Now, just to give a little bit of historical background, because as we mentioned last week, the letters to the churches are a twofold prophecy. When Jesus tells John to write it down, he says, write down the things that are and the things that will be hereafter, and then gives him the prophecies to these 7 churches. That these letters fit the churches as they are, and they're also a prophetic unfolding of the history of the Christian church. But I just want to highlight a few points about the church in John's day. And I found it interesting, Smyrna was an incredibly wealthy city. It was called the glory of Asia. It had a very prominent role, especially to do with the cult of emperor worship. It was the first place in the ancient world to build a temple in honor of the goddess of Rome. And at the center of Roman emperor worship. Okay, so the pagan cultic religion was incredibly strong and powerful in Smyrna. Once a year, every citizen was required to burn incense upon the altar to honor the divinity of Caesar. And once they did that, they were issued with a certificate saying that they had done their obligation and they were able to carry on in normal society. If they hadn't done that, they were shunned, they were persecuted, they were very much hated by the rest of society. But there was also a large population, a very strong Jewish community in Smyrna. And what it may sound strange enough at first when I was reading this, but they often joined in with the pagans in persecuting the Christians and in inciting the authorities to persecute the Christians, bringing charges against them of they're atheists, they're cannibals, they're disloyal to Rome, and all these things that they were doing. So the Jews were actually joining in with the pagans and persecuting the Christians because they wouldn't go along with these things. Now, I want to share something as well. I'll share my screen. This is something I found here. This is regarding the martyrdom of Polycarp. Now, Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John, who wrote Revelation. You know how we read through actually the apostles that Paul had, like Barnabas and Silas, and people that traveled around with him. Well, later on in his life, Polycarp was one of the people that traveled around with John the Apostle. And he was martyred in one of these Roman stadiums. And this is part of the epistle that's written to the church in Smyrna regarding his martyrdom. And I'll just read this paragraph out. It says, now as Polycarp was entering into the stadium, there came to him a voice from heaven saying, be strong and show thyself a man, O Polycarp. No one saw who it was that spoke to him, but those of our brethren who were present heard the voice. And as he was brought forward, the tumult became great, and they heard that Polycarp was taken. And when he came near, the proconsul asked him whether he was Polycarp. On his confessing that he was, the proconsul sought to persuade him to deny Christ, saying, "Have respect to thy old age," and other similar things according to their custom as such. Swear by the fortune of Caesar, repent, and say, away with the atheists. But Polycarp, gazing with stern countenance on all the multitude of the wicked heathen, then in the stadium, and waving his hands towards them, while with groans he looked up to heaven, said, "Away with the atheists." Then the proconsul, urging him and saying, "Swear, and I will set thee at liberty, reproach Christ," Polycarp declared, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my king and my savior? And I just find this, Polycarp was one of the leaders at the church in Smyrna. Okay, and his martyrdom here brought into the stadium in Smyrna to deny Christ, being charged with being an atheist, and charged with all these other accusations that were brought up against Christians. But not only was he brought in before these pagans and the governors there, but it's also recorded, I found it interesting, that there were many Jews that actually went into the stadium. We didn't read it there, but the trial of Polycarp and his martyrdom actually happened on the Sabbath. But the Jews living at that time hated Polycarp so much that they went into the stadium on the Sabbath to bring in an extra, I forget the word they used for it, to have him set on fire and killed. They brought all that to encourage it and to encourage the mob to have him killed. And so this gives us a bit of the background of what the Christians were actually living through in Smyrna. And so when Jesus is writing this letter to them, Polycarp was a little bit after the book of Revelation, but it's the city of Smyrna. This is the thing that was developing there. When Jesus writes to them and says, "I know thy works and thy tribulations," Jesus knows the things that they are living through. But I find it interesting as well. How does Jesus see them? When he says, "I know thy works, thy tribulation, and thy poverty," but then Jesus makes a comment on that. How does he see them?
Sees them as being rich.
And that stood out to me, and I made a note there when I was going through this, that God doesn't see things how we see things. It seems like martyrs being brought into the stadium and killed. I was looking at it before, the numbers of those that were killed around the same time. There was, on one case, 800 Christians were brought into the stadium and executed. On another one, there was another several hundred just brought in and all slaughtered. And it seems like at times that it looks like they might be like forsaken of their God. Why is God allowing this to happen? Look at all the tribulations, the poverties, the hardships that they're enduring. But God looks at them and sees that they are rich. They are rich in faith. They are rich in the rewards of the kingdom of heaven.
They were faithful.
Absolutely. Now, something that will become more evident as we go through the significance of this. In the letter to Ephesus, Jesus says, I know, your works, what you endured, your patience, and how you've tested those that say they are false, they are apostles, but are liars. Okay, he gave them a commendation, but then he had a rebuke for them. Okay, he says, you've left your first love. It's interesting though, Smyrna, only 2 of the 7 churches, Smyrna and Philadelphia, do not have any rebukes. Jesus has no reprimands to offer the church here enduring these persecutions. It's something that's often commented on, that when the church is going through persecutions, it's at its purest. Because, as it says, those that are rich in faith, the persecutions, the trials, the tribulations, foster that faithfulness. And so the church living this time, Jesus, after he given their appraisal, Jesus' counsel to them is, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. So he's saying these tribulations are going to come, being cast into prison, being put to death. But his first words, sorry, Galen, you got your hand up?
No, it's a case of when there's tribulation like that, as you say, it's when the church is at its purest, when it's most faithful, when it's most true. And that's when Christ can save them. That's when they're saved, is when they're in that condition that he wants, because they're reflecting him. So why wouldn't the enemy do that? Because he's trying to take everybody down. So it makes sense that that's exactly what he does. But of course, we also know that the blood that is shed is actually sowing seeds. So it really doesn't work.
Does someone want to read out 2 Timothy 3:12? Petra, you've got your hand up?
It's interesting that Ephesus, which gets a serious rebuke, has more things affirmed in it than Smyrna. All that Smyrna gets is, I know thy works and the situations that they're in. Whereas Ephesus, it's their works, their labor, their patience, how they can't bear the ones that are evil, how they've checked out the ones who say they're apostles and are not. So there's a much bigger list of things that are affirmed in Ephesus compared to Smyrna.
That is interesting. Just carrying on from that thought, I wonder if partly it's because, Jesus has that criticism for Ephesus, and it's quite a serious one. You've lost your first love. Okay, and the warning was, if they don't repent, Jesus will remove their candlestick. They will no longer be one of his churches. But he doesn't want them to get completely discouraged and downhearted and think all hope is lost. So he gives them, I know all what you're doing, your works, your labor, your patience, and everything you're doing. But on the other hand, for Smyrna, when he just says, I know your works, your tribulations, and your poverty, but thou art rich. I'm just thinking, when they're suffering and going through such hardships and tribulations and imprisonment and death. Sometimes the simplest thing is what helps the most. Just realizing that Christ knows. Okay, like he actually takes note of this. He hasn't ignored us. He hasn't forgotten about us. And his appraisal, I see your condition, but you are rich. You know, and that's in you know, we haven't looked at it yet, but the church at Laodicea, it's in stark contrast to that, the seventh church that we'll get on to look at, where they say they're rich and, you know, in need of nothing, but he says they're poor, miserable, blind, and naked. Christ sees their poverty, and he says, but you're rich. And I'm just thinking, for those that are suffering through these times, that's probably one of the greatest comforts, that Christ sees what we're having to endure for him. He takes note of it, and he counts them as being worthy, as being rich in faith, as having something more valuable than anything the world can offer.
Makes
I think
it makes sense also when you're really under trial. Things boil down to the barest basics.
Mm.
You know, you don't bother about details too much. You just stay focused on the basics. So that makes sense too. Sorry, Norm.
No, I could just add to that. What I was going to do was say the more dealing with the reignited democracy Australia, the more people understand the enemy and how vile the enemy is, and how ruthless and powerful, that they're realizing, as I am, as well as we all are, as time goes on to the end, that once we take our eyes off Christ, we suffer, we're depressed, we have anxiety, we have all the tools that Satan uses against us, and we become overwhelmed, and it's almost like he's devouring us if you keep your eyes on all that's going on. And so, yeah, the Lord even says here at the end in Smyrna, I think it says, whoever is victorious will not be harmed by the second death. So actually, the more we look into Christ, the more we become victors. The less we look at Christ, the more we fail, the more we become the enemy.
Absolutely. All right, can someone read at 2 Timothy 3:12?
Okay, 2 Timothy 3:12 says, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution.
And I find this interesting when we look at the seven churches as seven time periods that the church goes through. We said Ephesus was, you know, the first century, the church in the life of the apostles. And the counsel to them was that they were doing good. They had stuck to the truth. They had stuck to their standards, but they had lost their love when they were doing it. They had lost their first love. They had started to grow hard. And the counsel of them was to repent of that. Okay. And we see as the church moved on into this next phase, it seemed to have followed that instruction, and it had gone back to its first love. Okay. And it had been faithful. And so here, Christ has no rebuke for that church. But when the devil couldn't lead the church astray, when he couldn't corrupt it, when he couldn't separate them from Christ, okay, when the church was living godly in Christ Jesus, the next step the devil did was persecution. And so that's the next thing we see. When Satan couldn't infiltrate and corrupt the church, he brings persecution against the church. And if we jump to Hebrews 11, you know, the chapter of heroes of faith, there's a few examples of faith in there that really stand out to me. And I think the example of Moses fits in here quite well with what was said before about, you know, them being rich in faith and them actually understanding that the reward that Christ has for them. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. And I think the faith of these people is summed up quite well by what we read by the faith of Moses in Hebrews 11, verse 24 through to 27. Does someone want to read that?
Hebrews 11, 24 to 27.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I read. So he says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Verse 27 says, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible.
I think how the author of Hebrews there explains the faith of Moses fits really well with what's being asked here of the Christians living in the church in the time period of Smyrna. They're being asked to endure these things, looking forward to the hope that is before them. That's where he tells them, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He that overcomes shall not be hurt at the second death. Petra.
It also fits that if you want to be God's, that, you know, those he loves, he rebukes and chastens, the trials he allows to come our way are invitations to come into a closer relationship with him. So Moses, from these verses here in Hebrew, is clear that that's the case, and he sees the challenges as an opportunity to grow closer to God.
Amen.
We see that as well in the letter to Smyrna when he says, you know, behold, the devil will cast some of you into prison that ye may be tried.
Mm.
And so it's interesting. There's a quote from Spirit of Prophecy. I believe it's Thought of the Mountains of Blessings, page 72, I believe, where she talks about turning the other cheek. And Mrs. White brings out the idea that, you know, we have no need to resist evil, because if we are dwelling in Christ, okay, our lives are in his hands, and nothing can happen to us except by the Lord's permission. You know, and here it's sort of getting that same thing. The devil is casting these people into prison to try them. Okay, it's not happening to them because the devil is more powerful and getting the upper hand. It's happening to them in this case, it says, so that the Christians can be tried, their faith can be tried. And that's one thing Jesus says to the church in Laodicea, that they need to buy of him gold tried in the fire. You know, when the things are, you know, like metals are tried in the fire, they come forth more pure. And just thinking on that point, does anyone else thinking of other verses that talk about the reasons why God allows suffering? Can anyone else think of other verses on that?
No, but I have something to share, a testimony. I deal with a lot of men's groups and a lot of combat vets, and there's a lot of room and a lot of shadows, like we call them. And once you envelop through Christ, that surrender and for Him to work that good work in you, you don't become Satan's opponent anymore. And you're not riddled with all of the tools that Satan riddles you with. And you're more open for healing. And actually, victory is welcome over and over again. And it just initiates more faith and more ability to walk the walk you need to walk with Christ. So there's suffering, but there's a release. And that's powerful witness for witnessing to others as Christ wants us to do anyway.
Mm. Petra?
Yeah, this may well go with what you have been saying there, Norm. In Hebrews 12, 14 and 15, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord, looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. I think sometimes when we get when somebody is unfair towards us, or we see circumstances as unfair towards us, we can build bitterness in our minds towards that situation, and that will damage our relationship with God. You know, the follow peace with all men doesn't say to me be a doormat. And holiness, that peace and holiness that we need inside is that close walk and full surrender with God. But if we start to resent anything that is done towards us, we damage that, because we can't be fully surrendered to God and hold on to bitterness. So yeah, under trial, that would be far more the point.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Adi, I think, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, if I've got that right.
Yeah, you got it right. You got it right. Yeah, so I just wanted to bring your thoughts to Hebrews chapter 5, I think. I believe the writer of Hebrews is Paul, and there he talked about Jesus, though he being a son, learned obedience by the things which he suffered. So I think when Jesus tells the church of Smyrna to endure these persecutions and tribulations, he tells them to do that because he himself also had suffered while he was here on earth. And the suffering is essentially their stand on the truth. I believe that the suffering is the reaction we get from the world because we stand for the truth, because we know the truth. I just try to reverse to the earlier excerpt you read about Polycarp and the ruler. I think you said told him to recant his position about Christ. Now that's the basis for the persecution. Or, do you believe that he is sovereign, and do you believe that he's Lord? And he says no. So when he stands for the truth, then the persecution comes. Today it's still the same thing. When we stand for the truth, when we believe in Jesus as the Son of God, when we believe as the literal Son of God, when we believe that there is one true God, the world won't like that. And we can find succor in his message to the church in Smyrna, to not fear any of things that will be done to us, So if they persecute us, then it's possible that we're doing the right thing.
I really liked how you brought that back to the experience of Christ as well. You know, that though he was subject to unity obedience by the things that he suffered. And I'm just thinking, bring that into the message of the church of Smyrna here, when Jesus says, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." You know, Jesus is asking them to do the same thing that he did. Okay, or rather, he's not asking them to do anything that he didn't first do. You know, he was faithful unto death. He followed God's plan, right up to the cross, and died, and then was brought back to life. And he's promising to give them that same reward, that if they're faithful unto death, if they stand for the truth, then they will receive that crown of life. And I think that's significant when we look at as well how Jesus is introduced to this church. You know, Jesus introduced himself to a different way to each church. And if we look right at the very beginning of the message to the church in Smyrna, he says, "These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive." And so they're suffering persecution. And so there's this repeated reference to conquering death. Christ was dead and is alive. If you are faithful unto death, you will receive a crown of life. And then the final promise, "He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death." Bryce.
Yeah, like all this kind of reminds me of what the reformers went through, because I'm just in the middle of reading the Great Controversy and how God uses them as they're getting persecuted. It makes the priests or the oppositions see their wrong and make them dive deeper into the word, and they start their own ministry and reform. So God uses suffering in so many ways to spark something off in other people's lives. So yeah, like it's pretty amazing stories in that book, where there's like a father and a son who got persecuted, and then from there, because of that, it made loads of people turn to Jesus, so that really just reminded me in that sense.
Absolutely. If we turn to Luke 21, I'll actually read this out from verse 12 through to 15. It says, "But before all these," this is Jesus doing his like second coming, signs of the time things. He says, "Before all these, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you and deliver you up to the synagogues and into prison, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. And it shall turn to you for a testimony. Settle it therefore in your hearts, not to meditate before what ye shall answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to gainsay nor resist." And I think that sort of goes along very well with what you were saying, Bryce, and others as well, that, the persecution that is brought against us, it's one, an opportunity for us to grow, for us to, to grow in our character and faith, but also to be a witness to others so that others can see the reality of the truth we hold.
Amen.
That our faith isn't built on some feeling that as soon as situations change, it's gone with the wind. That our faith is built on a rock that will not be moved no matter what happens. And as far as the persecution developing character, I think the best passage for that comes to mind is in the book of James. Someone want to read James chapter 1, verse 2 to 4.
My brethren, Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing.
Now he said something like, when we go through that about the trying out of our faith works patience and produces in character developments. One word you normally don't use to describe that is joy, but that's what James uses. It's a joy when this stuff happens, when our characters are being grown, we're being shaped, we become more Christ-like, when our faith is tested and we endure. These are the things that are being asked of all Christians, but specifically the Church of Smyrna, with all the things that they are to endure. And I suppose bringing this back to the message that we got when it speaks about the devil will cast some of you into prison that you may be tried. Okay, when these things happen to us as Christians, to the Christians in the past and to us today, okay, it's not happening because the devil somehow gets the upper hand or because there are evil forces at work that are too powerful for us. When these things happen to us, it's according to the will of God to strengthen us so that we can go through this experience that James talks about, or that we can go through what Jesus talked about in Luke, so that we can be a testimony and a witness to those around us, so that they might see our faith, that it is built on a rock that just cannot be shaken, and that would lead them to question what they have believed, to look into the truth, and to hopefully to accept it. Petra. Have you got your hand up, Petra, or was that just left up from last time?
She may be having internet issues. It's been a bit rough of late.
Yeah. All right, no worries. Well, if you
Yeah, she
connect, yeah, she's just disconnected.
yeah.
To carry on, or have you guys moved on?
No, that's good. That's good. Did you have something to add?
Yeah. The disciples wanted peace.
Oh, I'm afraid you've cut out again. No worries. We'll carry on. Hopefully your internet connection sorts itself out. Just one thing to mention here. In Jesus, when he
on
gives
earth.
his
That was their expectation.
When Jesus gives his counsel to the Church of Smyrna, he mentions this 10 days tribulation period. Okay, you shall have tribulation 10 days. Now, when we look at the church, as the church time periods going on, was what Ephesus was, that first century church going, in the days where John the Apostle wrote this. This next church, the church under its period of persecution, goes from the first century right up until around 313 is the date most people put on it. And the last 10 years of that was under this persecution of Emperor Diocletian. It was the most intense persecution the Christians had endured. And that's because Diocletian was an interesting man who was very into the idea that he should be worshipped. He In fact, he even claimed he was the brother to the sun and moon, and demanded to be worshipped as such. And of course, when the Christians wouldn't worship him as a deity, that's what started his intense 10-year period of persecution, going from 303 AD through to 313. That was ended by the Edict of Tolerance in Constantine, which moves us into the next time period that we find under the Church of Pergamos that we'll look at next week. But the closing promise to the church in Smyrna is, he that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. So when we looked at Ephesus, we saw that the challenge that they had to overcome was that it was easy to stand for the truth, to test people, to find out those that are teaching lies, and to those that are practicing things that are ungodly, and to sift them out. Okay, it's easy to stand for the truth, but it's hard to do that while remaining true to Christ. It's hard to do that while remaining loving, without leaving your first love. Okay, that was what they were called to overcome, to stand for the truth, a firm, strong defense of the truth, while remaining faithful to Christ in that loving gospel relationship. So what is the test for the church of Smyrna? What are they called to overcome in order to receive this promise?
Well, it seems like they have to listen to the Spirit instead of trying to do their own understanding. Because once I start to try to understand, I can even get rageful about what's happening to the innocent, especially children nowadays. And I could become almost berserk of anger and vengeance and rebellion and all those things, you know. And I think of Job, you know, all what was against Job, and then Job finally shrouded himself with Christ and said, "Slay me. You know, although you slay me, I will still trust." So it's beyond even our imagination. It's beyond what we understand what's going on. We have to be beyond that. And that's what I believe he's asking. They must listen to the Spirit of God.
Mm-hmm. Galen?
I think part of it too is the fact that they are to be faithful unto death. They are to allow themselves to go through that trial, but also being faithful in the fact that knowing that there is
It should be all right.
better to come. With regards to eternity, and they will get their reward as long as they seek Christ and remain faithful to him, just like he was faithful to his Father.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Colin, have you got that hand up there?
Yeah, that's my little wand.
Yeah, wand, yeah.
Thank you. Greetings to everyone. I obviously joined late. one thing I've always wondered, and you might have already addressed it, but spare me, is why is it unto the angel of the church? Well, what's the significance of that? That the message is to the angels, or the angel of each of these churches?
Mhm. That's actually not something we've looked at yet. I believe Jesus talks about that in Revelation, the end of chapter 1. Sorry, in chapter 1, John sees Jesus having 7 stars in his hand, walking in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, and he says that the 7 stars in his right hand are in verse 20, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. Now, one thing that is worth noting is the word angel is simply transliterated, but I'll share my screen. The difference between a translation and a translation is where you take a word in another language and use an equivalent word in the second language that you're translating to. A transliteration is where you just use the word in the first language and adopt that word into it. Angel is one of the words where we've done that too. So here you can see, this is what I've got, Revelation up here, where he says the angels of the 7 churches. The word angel there is there, angelos. We've just taken the Greek word angelos and used that in the English word angel. But if you look at its meaning, it just means a messenger. Okay. It can be used of an angel as in a heavenly messenger, or in this case, it actually says an implication, a pastor or a minister to the church, someone who delivers that message. Paul talks about himself as being an angel of God. I'm not sure if that's to the Corinthians or Galatians. He mentions that. So the angel is the messenger. So the question is, here in Revelation, is it to an angelic messenger that oversees the church, or to the messengers of the church, the ministers of the church that are to take this message to the people? And
So I've got one of these Bibles that Petra showed us. I just looked it up. It's item number 32. Yeah, a messenger, especially an angel, by implication, a pastor, angel, or a messenger.
yeah.
So I could have found that out myself, but there you go.
Yeah.
Well done.
That's all good. That's all. Well, like I said, we hadn't actually covered it, so it's actually good you brought it up.
I have something to share there on that too.
Yeah.
I have a footnote here. If you look in chapter 2, verse 8, 12, and 18, it talks about messages or messengers.
So does your version of the Bible doesn't say angel in those verses? It says messenger.
No, it just says on 2:8 here, Colin, it says, "This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, who is dead but is now alive." And then in 2:12, it says, "Write this letter to the angel of the church in Pergamum. This is the message from the one with the sharp two-edged sword." And then in 18, it says, "Write this letter to the angel of the church in Thyatira. This is the message from the Son of God, whose eyes are like flames of fire, whose feet are like polished bronze." And this is the New Living Translation.
Yeah. So I suppose that I'm not sure on this one, but I do wonder if that's got something to do as well with the format of writing letters, because each message to the church is an actual structured as sort of a message to be written to that church.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
Jesus has a message to speak to each church. And so he's saying unto the angel, the messenger of that church, write this message for them to deliver to the church.
Yeah, I think Daniel Messer, is one of his latest sort of study sets has been to work out or learn more about angels in the Bible. And I think, you know, I can't quote him. I get the feeling from him that we apply too much closed shop, they're in heaven type feeling to an angel, whereas they are, you know, like everyone knows about a guardian angel. It's almost like it's the angel is our portion of the Spirit of God or something, you know, in a different sort of mindset. Certainly, yeah, we shouldn't distance ourselves from the idea of angels being all around us and with us and helping us and keeping us, and
Amen.
Yeah.
and of God making use of angels to assist in that.
I remember reading about Elijah being on Mount Carmel when it's just him and I think like 400 prophets of Baal and 450 prophets of the Grove. So there's Elijah standing on one side and 850 false prophets standing on the other side against him. And Ellen White just made a comment on that. I'm just paraphrasing it, saying something about those the 850 false prophets had no idea how outnumbered they were, because there was one Elijah there, and then the rest of the mountain was filled with heaven's angels.
Right.
You know, and even at the Jesus in the garden, when Peter pulls out his sword, he says, "Do you not know I could pray and the Father would send me 12 legions of angels?" You know, like that's a legion of angels for every one of the disciples. You know, that's how many angels God's got at his disposal to send down. And we see the same thing with Elisha, when the city's surrounded by the Assyrian army and a servant comes to him and he prays, saying, "Lord, open his eyes." And he sees the Assyrian army surrounded by chariots of fire. You know, it's, yeah. God's angels are hard at work, carrying out his will here on earth as in heaven. Yeah, it's just, we don't see that. It's all that behind the scenes stuff that is invisible to us, but they're always working there, influencing people for heaven. You know, you will never know until we get to heaven just how much influence they had over the things in our lives.
It's a strange thing that when I say a strange thing, it's a beautiful thing that we struggle to let God in many aspects of our life, and we've been realizing the need in our family situations to stop trying to do what God needs to do. And so much of the last 10 years even of our life cycle has been that fell into place, this fell into place, you know, just numerous little things. You can't sort of tally them up, but you just think, man, I think God's hand was in that. And it certainly makes you want to have more faith than you realize you didn't have. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Adi.
Yeah, just a thought I had having as we read through the message to this church. I'm just wondering how challenging witnessing would have been at that time. There seems to be no incentive to in witnessing to people. It's more like you're telling people about the gospel, and you're also, telling them there's a chance if you accept this, you can die at any time. It's quite scary at that time, and you wonder the kind of people that will be willing to accept such a message. It seems to me that's part of the reason why they had no rebuke,
Hmm.
because these people, having no thing to gain for at the time, were willing to accept this message and stand by it even to death. And it's just a thought for me, and that in contrast to what we have today, it's just something interesting for me. And then how Jesus closes the message in saying that to those who overcome, they will not be hurt by the second death. That's very reassuring for this church. Quickly putting into perspective that the death that they were going to face was the first, and there was going to be another one that they would not have to suffer.
Hmm.
So just a thought from me.
Absolutely. It really does, bring to mind that the idea of when Christ talks about carrying your cross, that message that Christ spoke about being so, central to the gospel. You must carry your cross daily. And what that actually meant to those in the church of Smyrna, it had a very clear meaning that could not be avoided. When you chose to become a Christian in the church of Smyrna, you knew what it meant to carry your cross, and you had to make that choice and follow through on it. Whereas in our days and in other time periods where that persecution isn't so imminent, it's almost like you can choose to become a Christian and then later on decide whether or not you want to carry a cross. But you don't have that, I'd say luxury, but it's more you don't have that temptation in the church in Smyrna. So you get people that, if you believe, it's a full commitment. And so I think that's absolutely right what you're saying. Ian.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, we were late as well. But yeah, I'm wondering if we've just done Smyrna, is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah, we watched this. I don't know if you've seen this Polycarp movie. I think it might be set in the time of Smyrna.
Yes, he was the Bishop of Smyrna.
Yeah, so we watched that last night, as it turns out. But if you haven't watched it, it's actually a good watch and good for right now for us here in Australia, especially who are going through, potential job loss and just changing of lifestyle and giving up. But I just wanted to ask, what did you decide the 10 days of tribulation represented?
The 10 days of persecution under Emperor Diocletian, sorry, the 10 years, if you take prophecies a day for a year. There's a big list of, I think, 13 emperors going from, what I got here, your Tarjans in AD 98, which is around the time John wrote the Revelations, that actually passed laws banning Christianity and persecuting it. You had the earlier persecutions of Nero, but he was more of a, I don't know, I want to say a nutcase, but I was trying to think of a different word. But these other emperors passed laws and established legal precedents for the persecution and execution of Christians. And there was about 13 emperors from the end of the 1st century right up into Constantine in 313, who signed the Edict of Tolerance. But the final 10 years of that under Diocletian was the worst persecutions. Now, I shared before how Diocletian claimed that he was the brother of the sun and moon, and so needed to be worshipped as a deity himself. And anyone to make that type of claim, when someone refuses to do it, when you're the emperor, you claim to be a deity and to be worshipped, and you're looking out and then there's these people not worshipping you. He hated that, and he brought full persecution against them. And so that fits really well with what Jesus said to the church in that time period.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, you're probably repeating yourself, but I love how in here it's clear that Satan's the one that's doing the testing, that he's the one who causes the calamity and the tribulation. God doesn't deliberately do that to us. He allows it, obviously, but he's not the source of the trouble.
It's like what you read in Romans 8, that God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. It's not that all things are good or God doesn't bring all these things, but when they come, God turns them all towards good. The persecutions that came upon the Christians in this time period, as someone mentioned before, the phrase that was coined by, I think, Tertullian, where he says that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the gospel. Yet Satan brought this persecution against the Christians to try to kill them and stomp out the gospel. But God took that and turned it into a testimony for the truth of the gospel and for its ability to change lives, and that testimony for the truth. It's just like, Satan, tried to bring the utmost torture and suffering on Christ on the cross. But in doing that and having him crucified, God sealed the salvation of all of humanity. God is able to take anything that we're enduring and turn it towards good, for a testimony to our faith, for a perfection of our character. Petra.
Yeah, just following on from what you said there, Ian. Good that it's showing that it's Satan, not God, but that's also useful as well in understanding. We talked before about not getting bitter when you're under trial. When we know that it's Satan, we're not so likely to hold personal grudges against the people that are persecuting us or making life tough. Because as soon as we start to hold personal grudges against people, we start to hold bitterness inside, and it separates us from God. So, yeah, we need to not take challenges personally, though God can use them to personally benefit us. This is just Satan trying to get at God. We need to butter what's not our business.
I think I just put a thing in the chat there. I think that's the movie that Ian was referring to. It looked like the same cover. Yeah, there it is.
It's only about 65, 70 minutes, I think, or a bit longer than that maybe, but it's well done.
Something else that stands out to me in the message to this church is when Jesus begins giving them, so he does the introduction of himself as he that was dead and is alive. then the appraisal, telling them that he knows the works, what they are enduring, and the falsehoods of those who say they're Jews that are not of the synagogue of Satan. Okay, I know who you are, that you are rich in faith, and I know who those people are that are bringing these persecutions and accusations against you. Okay, the rest of the world might be deceived and believing the lie and hating you, but I know the truth. And then he starts his speaking to them about telling them what they're going to, again, endure and what they need to do. And he starts off with the words, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. And I just find that interesting. Christ is sitting there knowing everything they're going to have to endure, okay, being cast into prison, being killed, being persecuted, and he tells them, do not fear any of those things. And for some reason, that just really resonated with me, the assurance of Christ to give us that comfort. Yes, these things that we're going to endure, but you do not fear them. It brings to mind in the Gospels where he's talking about being brought before councils and rulers, and he tells you, do not think beforehand what you will say, because in that very hour, God will give you the words to speak. That trusting in that everything that we're going to endure, God has it in control. Do not fear, but trust in him. And to be honest, sometimes when I think of that, you think of the type of faith that needs, to be, like things seem to be getting a little bit bad and all around the world. But imagine you're traveling somewhere in Iran or Saudi Arabia or China, one of these other countries, you get arrested for your faith and you get brought before their court, and you're not going to get a fair trial, okay? And you're being accused of being a Christian, and you're going to prison, you're going to be tortured, you're going to be executed, and just to approach that situation without fear, trusting in the words of Christ, like the type of faith that takes, just speaks of that closeness of relationship that we have available to us. And I think sometimes we don't appreciate the level to which the gospel can transform us to take us to that point. And I just find that's just an incredible thing to ponder.
I think many people are pondering what you just said, because Matthew, I see a lot of people that are atheists or New Age, non-Christian, but conservative. And I went to these meetings of Reignited Democracy Australia for Truth. It was like a magnet to me because I am Seventh-day Adventist, not the world Seventh-day Adventist, but Christ in me, the church in me, and his truth. And people are yearning for that. I see that more and more each and every time I'm able to go to a meeting or a march. And I give out Sunday law books at a march. And I said, this is the big one. And the vaccine is the smaller one, but it's leading into that. And so I see that a lot of people that weren't Christian are looking in their Bible. And it's getting to the point where people have to recognize the truth they're really searching for. And I think a lot of people are identifying with these days.
Petra.
Yeah, just looking at Ephesus in contrast to Smyrna or alongside Smyrna, however you want to put it. Ephesus was told to remember their first love. When I read that, remember, that puts me back to the fourth commandment, which has to do with resting in God, which again is trust. The people at Ephesus were caught up in fighting the error and the false believers around them. They got caught up in that themselves instead of realizing God's place. So in a lot of ways, they were getting caught up trying to do God's work, and it blocked them from their trust in God. It's like they felt they had to get in there and do it instead of trusting God to. So both of these churches are told to trust, but Ephesus from the point of don't take on a fight that is not yours, it's God's. Whereas with Smyrna, it's fear. But they're both called to trust, but from angles. And with each of them, the battle is inside the believer's head. It's their approach to what's happening around them, which fits very well that saying it's not what happens to you, but it's how you react to it that counts.
Utmost.
Amen. Amen.
And that's the blessed assurance we have, huh?
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's the key. I'm just thinking through to overcoming. And all the churches, really, it's about trust. It's about trusting in God, committing ourselves to Him in every different area of our life. And each church, while it's a church in the days of John, and it's a time period throughout the different ages of the Christian church that it's gone through. It's also different conditions that we can find ourselves in. You know, there's that line in every church: he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. Okay, so yes, the message was written to the churches in John's day. Yes, it's for a time period of the church throughout the Christian age, but the message is also to anyone who has an ear to hear. Anyone who's willing to listen to what Christ is saying, this message is for them. And so the message for us in overcoming is dealing with trust in Christ. For the church in Ephesus, it meant standing up for the truth of God, but speaking that truth in love. Okay, don't let yourself become hardened by all of the lies and deception that Satan's trying to bring in. Balancing that, speaking the truth in love, and that putting putting the outcomes in Christ's hands. That's our job, to speak the truth in love. And then Smyrna, when God, or rather Satan, couldn't corrupt the church, he decides to persecute it. And so their overcoming again is trusting God. Okay, not allowing the persecutions, the things that we're going to endure, count us to, realizing that the reward that he has before us is of greater riches than anything that we will have to endure, anything that we will lose here. That's why Jesus starts out to them: I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. Being faithful unto death, receiving the crown of life. And so it's seeing that, I suppose it's seeing that the rewards of heaven are more beneficial, more rich, more vast than any of the tribulations we would have to suffer in this world. God knows those that say they are Jews but are not, but they're synagogue of Satan. He knows the faith that we have, that we're enduring through suffering. Just be faithful, no matter what it costs, and leave the rest in God's hands, and we'll be safe. We will not be hurt at the second death. We will have that crown of life. And so that's what this church is called to overcome, and indeed what we're also called to overcome is that fear of persecution. I just want to jump back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus starts off with the Beatitudes, all the different blessings of the Sermons on the Mount. And he finishes with this in verse 10. He says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." And that there is sort of the message to overcoming in Smyrna, and for us as well, whenever we experience these situations. It's about trusting in God, enduring the persecution, being faithful no matter what happens, and we shall receive that reward. Petra.
So with Smyrna, he's really saying, look at your situation from the point of the currency of heaven. You know, and he's saying, hey, I've overcome death. You know, the currency of the earth often is life over everything else. You've got to stay physically alive. A lot of people, that is their primary focus. Whereas what Jesus is saying here to this church is, if you have life in me, the currency of the world, whether you live or die, it doesn't rate. Whereas with Ephesus, you know, we've got him here walking in the middle of the golden candlesticks. So the message with that to this church that has forgotten that he's there with them, because if they knew that he was right there with them, if that was the foremost thought in their mind, I don't think they would have got hard. I don't think they would have tried to fight for him. You know, so he's saying, and here I'm walking amongst the candlesticks. I'm right here with you. I can deal with this if you will just step out of the way and choose for me to deal with this for you, so that you can concentrate on your relationship with me.
I like when you talk about seeing things through heaven's currency. It reminds me of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where you had, you know, the man living wealthy, rich and everything, and Lazarus, this beggar, you know, at the gate. And so from the world's point of view, one man's done everything right and one man's made a wreck of his life. But Jesus talks about then they both died. The beggar ended up in heaven in Abraham's bosom, whereas the rich man ended up in suffering and torment. You know, and it's saying that you know, because, you know, he kept all his wealth for himself, he didn't care for others, he didn't have faith in God, he had faith in his own riches. But and Jesus in that parable is saying that how things appear in this life isn't necessarily how they appear in the next. God's not interested in outward appearance. And that's sort of the same thing he says in this message here, when he says, I know thy works, thy tribulation, and thy poverty, but you're rich. So to the world, you look like the downtrodden, the cast out, the ones that God's forgotten about. But in reality, you're rich. You're rich in faith in the kingdom of heaven. And then he says, I know the blasphemies of those that say they are Jews, but are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Okay? That those that say they're Jews, that have all the synagogues, that have all the churches, you know, these big religious organizations, okay, that are claiming to be the true church. Okay? But Jesus says, no, I know their blasphemies and their lies, and that they are actually the synagogue of Satan. And so you have here the two groups of people, almost two churches emerging here in Smyrna. The ones that are God's true people that seem downtrodden, outcast, and the ones that are the false people, those that say they're Jews but are not, that are the ones in the synagogues, running the churches, running the organizations. So to the world, this group looks like they've got everything sorted, like God's blessing them, like they're prosperous. And this group looks like they're poverty, they're struggling, they're being persecuted. They look like they've forgotten about God. They look like they're receiving all the blessings. But Jesus speaks to them and saying, that's not the way I see it. You are rich in faith, and they are of the synagogue of Satan. I just find interesting that sort of reversal of fortunes, teaching us to see things, as Petra was saying, from heaven's eyes, using heaven's currency. Ralph.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the heaviest thing in the Bible, 2 Corinthians 4:17, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. An eternal weight, and glory being character. So it's a eternal thing to become more and more like Jesus. And what we face here is nothing. Yeah.
Amen.
I don't know about other people here, but just going through these last couple of churches, when I was approaching the study, in my mind, I had, okay, yep, it's relevant to the churches in John's days. You got the church periods throughout Christian history, and there's some lessons in there for us. But I was looking at focusing mainly on where it was for the church in prophetic history. I thought that would be the bulk of it. But going through it, studying it and discussing it with the things people are sharing here, it strikes me how much of everything that was said to Ephesus, dealing with those say they're apostles and not, but are lies, and all these other corruptions and stuff that Satan's trying to bring into the church, the deeds of the Nicolaitans and all this stuff, and Smyrna, all the things here, how much that actually applies to our situation today, and that we can see it all right there on the horizon, and things that we've already experienced. Not always in the same intensity as spoken out here, but it's all the same stuff that is very applicable to the things we're enduring today. That's something that stood out to me, and I'm not sure how many others are feeling the same way as we're looking through these.
Sure.